very hard to figure out when the first kings appeared in history, but archaeologists have dug up the graves of people who look a lot like kings and queens as far back as 20 or 30,000 years ago. Back in the Ice Age, when much of Europe and North America was covered with frozen glaciers, and people were hunting mammoths. Every now and then, they discover a grave completely full of beads and necklaces and crowns and scepters made from ivory and shells, and other things people thought were very precious at the time. They seem extremely regal. Whoever was buried in them was clearly very important and considered different from everybody else. But when archaeologists inspect the bodies more carefully, they usually discover they were different in other ways as well. Most were physically strange. Some were really tall, almost like giants. Some were dwarfs or hunchbacks. Even the ones that seemed normal from their skeletons probably didn't look very normal at the time. Maybe one of their eyes was brown and one was blue. How would we know from the skeleton? So, what does all this mean? Well, we can't know for sure, but what we do know is that mammoth hunters, long ago, spent a lot of their time making really elaborate and beautiful costumes for some very unusual looking people. The kind of thing that later would have been called fit for a king. But that aside from that, there was no sign of a kingdom. There isn't the slightest evidence of any palaces, courts, treasuries, armies, or anything like that. Instead, people seem to have scattered out in little family groups in the summer, and then, in the winter, gathered together again in what were almost tiny little cities where they had feasts and festivals. Sometimes there were great collective houses covered in mammoth tusks. But never do you see special palaces or forts or mansions just for kings. So, who were these strange people? Our best guess is maybe they were play kings. Maybe strange-looking people were considered divine, just because they look so strange. Maybe they even treated them like gods sometimes. For instance, during festivals or other celebrations, even though at other times they were just ordinary, strange-looking people. Maybe theater and games where one person was made king and could do anything they liked came first. And only later did people forget that they were just playing. But how did that happen? Still, that doesn't explain how some people ended up in a position where they could tell everybody else what to do, let alone pass that position on to their children. Was it because they were so charming or beautiful that people just somehow wanted to do whatever they said? Or were they so clever they managed to trick everyone into thinking they were gods? Or were they just really big and scary? And even if they were more charming or brilliant or terrifying than anyone else, how did they manage to convince everyone to let their children take over when they died, since their children might just as easily be weak or ugly or stupid? We don't know. But that isn't going to stop us from guessing, so here's one idea. Maybe it was all just a game that went terribly wrong. Let's go back to those gods again. Even people who don't have kings often think gods and goddesses act a little like kings, imposing all sorts of rules on us and punishing anyone who breaks them. Now, some of these rules are always very sensible. Be generous to strangers or don't break other people's things. But others just seem completely random. You can never eat corn when it's raining. Every Friday you have to eat fish. And often, no one knows why these rules exist, but always they're quite sure that if they don't follow them, something very bad will happen, even if they're not always sure what. Say you eat corn when it's raining, and then somebody's cat gets hit by lightning. Then you're in trouble because everyone will think it was your fault. So here's one idea. Maybe it was all a game of make-believe. Let's imagine, during certain times of year, people would dress up in costumes and pretend to be gods and goddesses and dragons and monsters. This isn't hard to imagine because there are still some places like Greenland or Tierra del Fuego where they still do. Let's also imagine, since this is true too, there are drums, music, dancing, games and speeches and funny voices when the gods appear. But also, very complicated rules about who could sing what song or dance what dance and how they had to do it. So far, this seems like innocent good fun, but here's where it gets difficult. In everyday life, you don't need anyone to enforce the rules. It's enough to know everyone will get mad at you if you break the rules, and then someone's cat gets hit by lightning. But when the gods actually show up, it's different. There are too many rules. But you also don't want the people playing gods to enforce the rules, because gods should be too high and mighty to have to pay attention to who's sitting when they're supposed to be standing or talking out of turn. So you get someone to be master of ceremonies. Often these ceremonies were the only time anyone got to order anyone else around. So you have to be careful that the person who enforces the rules isn't taken too seriously. So often that person would be a clown. They enforced the rules, but the rules didn't apply to them. They could be as silly as they liked. In fact, they were supposed to be silly. But they were also a little like police. They could punish people for breaking the rules. Sometimes they'd intentionally try to confuse everyone, do the ceremony wrong, tell jokes, pretend to fall flat on their face, but no one was supposed to laugh. If anyone laughed, they'd make them pay a fine, or throw them in the air, or take their clothes away. Since they could do anything, sometimes they'd make up new rules. Now, let's imagine these games started lasting for weeks or even months, which did sometimes happen. Well, maybe at some point, people forgot that they were playing a game. Maybe they started acting like that all the time, and the people who got to make up the rules became kings.